Welcome to Digital Learning, an initiative of Directorate of Collegiate Education, Government of Karnataka. This session will focus on the central idea and the themes of the poem The Worm, written by Nissim Ezekiel, prescribed for second semester BA General English, affiliated to Bengaluru North University. I am Nandana NG, Assistant Professor of English, Government First Grade College, Bagipalli. The contents of the session: learning objectives, followed by the session outcome, and later we'll have a recap of the previous session so that we can gauge as to how much of knowledge we have accumulated on this topic. And then we shall proceed towards the central idea of the poem, or the discussion about the central ideas prevalent in the poem, the major themes that can be seen throughout the poem, the poetic devices, and lastly recapitulation, or wherein we'll try to assimilate everything that we have discussed in the course of the presentation, and finally a small multiple choice question session wherein we can assess ourselves about whatever we have learned through the course of this presentation. The learning objectives of this session: to recapitulate previous knowledge. This is of almost utmost importance, because only when we recapitulate, or only when we try to reminisce, or only when we recollect whatever we have learnt in the previous session, we can actually better apply it to what we are going to learn this session. Later, to acquaint with poetry as a literary genre, to develop interest for reading a poem, to analyze the central idea of the poem, and then discuss the themes in the poem, to comprehend or understand the poetic devices in the poem, to enlarge the imaginative power of the students. The session outcomes are as follows. By the end of this session, the student can be acquainted with poetry as a literary genre, to develop interest for reading a poem, analyze the central idea of the poem. A discussion of the themes will enable the student to better understand the poem, to comprehend the poetic devices of the poem, and all of this in turn will help to enlarge the imaginative power of the students. Let us recap what we learned in the previous session. The Worm poem by Nissim Ezekiel has been introduced in the previous session, and also a critical analysis of the poem was dealt with in detail in the previous session. So, to recap, or trying to put or encapsulate whatever we have learned, in the poem The Worm, conflict between nature and man can be clearly seen. The speaker, who is represented by the poem himself, is jealous when he sees the worm crawl in a straight line towards his destination. Here we can actually see the discriminatory attitude of the poet, wherein he feels as a human being he belongs to a superior species, while a worm which is inferior to him is better equipped than him. Further, he has more trust in the follies of the common man than in the wisdom of the uncommon man. The speaker accepts that he can emulate, match, or surpass the worm's directness only in anger, and hence he killed the worm. In fact, to put it directly, the speaker is more or less jealous of the fact that the worm is better than him, and so he kills the worm. Here, the man kills the worm and reports the fact. So, all in all, the speaker, represented by the poet, demonstrates a wish to escape society and understand himself and his own motives. Coming to the central idea of the poem, Ezekiel usually shows how man and the objects of nature cause harm to each other. During the prevalent crisis, we can clearly see that man has tried to dominate over nature, and as a result, the conflict with nature can be clearly seen. In the worm, there is a conflict or a dispute between nature and man. Here, the man kills the worm and reports the fact. Somewhere, the man seems to have a sort of a superior ego, that he is better off than the other species. Further, he has more trust in the follies of common man than in the wisdom of the uncommon man. The poet persona, or the personality, gets inspired by the way of this tiny creature. Yes, a human being, though we consider ourselves to be the superior creation of God, yet there are many other species which are better in their ways than us. Like here, for example, the worm, the way it moves, the poet is inspired, but somehow his false ego comes in the way, and he cannot accept that the small worm is much better than him. But in the complexity of the modern world, the persona finds it difficult to find and follow that path. This can be seen in society in various aspects, wherein a person who is honest, humble, who is very straightforward, who is righteous, if somebody tries to follow that person, he is considered as a kind of a loser, to put in colloquial terms. So here also likewise, though the poet admires the worm, yet in the complexity of the modern world, he finds it difficult to follow that path. He doesn't want to be maybe mocked at. Ezekiel's the worm is ruled by oppositions and paradoxes, beginning with the character of the speaker himself. Paradox means wherein two opposite ideas or forces are put together. In this poem, the worm and the speaker both are paradoxical in nature. The speaker who wishes so badly to emulate the worm can only do so through anger and destruction, which is the opposite of the worm's own indifferent directness. Thus, even though the speaker himself believed to be similar to the worm at the end of the poem, he also reveals himself to be inherently different, as he is not free from outside influences as the worm in the line 11 of the poem. Look at the observe the line, strategic as a worm and therefore free. Somewhere this seems to be a question posed by himself to all the human beings. We can actually sum it up by saying that the speaker and the worm are thus paradoxically both the same and different. In fact, you can say that they are mirror images of themselves. Now let us try to look at the themes that can be seen in the poem. These are the prevalent themes, or these are the dominating themes there. The first theme, the opposing forces of creation and destruction. Opposing means which are contradictory to each other. Creation means giving life to, destruction is ending it. So when considering the worm, the speaker meditates on the God that created it. Yes, the man is jealous. The speaker, or the man represented by man, he is jealous because he realizes the person or the God who created man also created the worm. So he says in these lines, the God who made you to be wiser than the cunning subtleties within my brain shall know by this the anger of a man. Somewhere the human being or the speaker persona is trying to show to God by saying that you created human being as a superior species. I have the cunningness, I have the intelligence in my brain, yet this inferior brain that is created by you is better off than me. So I am going to show to you that my anger, with the help of my anger, I can be more powerful than you. The speaker blames the natural endowments that were given to the worm and himself during creation for his own act of destruction. Here, this is something we need to understand. The natural endowments refers to qualities or characteristic features. Human being has been given many endowments by God, the best among them being reasoning power and the speech power. But still, look at where we are. Using these so-called natural endowments that has been bestowed upon us by God, we have tried to, in fact, create God himself. Likewise, when you consider the worm has these basic endowments, but still with those basic characteristic quality features, the worm is able to succeed much better than the human being. So the human persona says, only in anger can I emulate the worm's directness. I have killed the worm. Somewhere he knows he can never surpass or match the worm in his directness. So out of sheer jealousy, he says, I have killed the worm. It is the creation of both the speaker and the worm that results in the moment of destruction. God versus human supremacy can be clearly seen in the poem The Worm, written by Nissim Ezekiel. When mulling or wondering over the worm's directness, the capitalized G in God signifies that the speaker is a believer in one God and therefore capitalizes his name. In contrast, however, the speaker makes the decision not to capitalize the G in God when musing or wondering over whoever created the God. It is as if to say, my creator is the God, while the person or while the force which created the worm is not up to his mark. So look at, observe the lines. The God who made you to be wiser than the cunning subtleties within my brain shall know by this the anger of a man. He at once respects a God which might acknowledge his existence while simultaneously bringing God down grammatically as the speaker destroys the God's creation by killing the worm. In fact, this actually shows the petty nature of human being, wherein when it comes to his own existence, he acknowledges God with a capital G. But if it comes to the point that it was the same God who created the worm, he cannot accept that. So somewhere we can see the petty nature of the human being. Another prominent theme in the poem is the symbol of fear and self-doubt. Obviously, this is represented by the speaker, the poet, or the human being here. Even though the speaker has just killed the worm, he forgives himself in the eyes of God. As I told you before, human beings have started playing God. So he says here, the God who made you to be wiser than the cunning subtleties within my brain shall know by this the anger of a man. The worm here can be read as a symbol of fear and self-doubt. No, I mean, what I'm trying to say here is the human being, when he looks at the worm, he is fearful of his own drawbacks and he starts doubting his own capacity. However, once it's gone, once the competition of the worm is demolished with, the hollow repetition of what he has done remains. The person's psychology or the person's conscience is quite aware of what he has done, so he states it as a matter of fact, I have killed the worm. Self-knowledge and self-awareness. In the introductory session also, I have reiterated this point. Self-knowledge, being aware of ourselves, being aware of our drawbacks, being able to recognize our mistakes, introspection, trying to see where we are going wrong. All these are of utmost importance for a person to grow both physically and mentally. So here the speaker is so astutely aware of his own folly in this poem. The speaker thus uses this encounter with the worm as a momentary lapse in rational behavior or understanding. Because of this, he can understand and relate his senseless decision to kill the worm completely. The speaker demonstrates a wish to escape society and understand himself and his own motives. Let us try to look at the poetic devices that are available in the poem. The first important aspect is the poem does not contain a strict meter or a rhyme scheme. The entire poem is one stanza that relates the entire encounter with the worm over the course of 20 lines. Ezekiel uses enjambment to create visual and sonic tension within the poem. At the climax of the poem, the speaker reveals that the worm is dead with a line break in the middle. So now it's dead. There is a beautiful pause for ambiguity in between those lines. Additionally, the words themselves are stretched out over the page, which brings the reader's attention to that moment. Let us try to recapitulate whatever we have discussed through the course of the presentation. Coming to the central idea of the poem, the central idea of the poem can be said that it is ruled by oppositions and paradoxes. Man and objects of nature causing harm to each other can be clearly seen here. In the worm, there is a conflict between nature and man, though inspired by the worm, unable to emulate it. Yes, the human being somewhere is inspired by the worm's simple ways of achieving his dreams, yet he cannot accept that the inferior worm is better than him, and so he kills it. Coming to the themes, the four prominent themes that we discussed in the poem are the conflict between God and human supremacy. Look at the irony here. God created human beings and now human beings have started considering themselves superior to God. Then the conflict or the themes of creation and destruction, the symbol of fear and self-doubt, self-knowledge and self-awareness. So these are the themes that are quite prominently seen in the poem The Worm, written by Nissim Ezekiel. Now let us assess ourselves through the course of this small multiple choice question session. The worm poem consists of how many lines? 30, 20, 10 or 5? And the answer is option B, 20. What makes the worm to move towards a drier place? Inner eye, fear, randomness or none of the above? It's very clearly depicted in the poem that the worm was able to move towards a drier place with the help of its inner eye. The speaker is inspired by the poem. This is a statement. What do you think is the answer? Is the poem inspired by is the speaker inspired by the worm? Yes, no, maybe none of the above. The answer is option A, yes. The speaker is inspired by the worm, but he is unable to accept that and he kills the worm. The opposing force of creation is construction, cremation, destruction or constriction, and the opposing word of creation is destruction. Now this is a sentence taken from the poem, so try filling it up. Pretty worm, where is your dash? And the answer is, options provided are vision, strength, destination or home, and the answer is pretty worm, where is your strength? The references for the presentation: